Hi, I'm Jacob Hornberger, president of the Future of Freedom Foundation, and this is this week's issue of the Libertarian Angle. I'm joined, as I am always, by my co-host Richard Ebeling, who teaches economics at the Citadel. Richard, welcome back to the Libertarian Angle.
Great to be here and with our listeners and viewers.
Yeah, we've got part 5 of our World War II series, which we're receiving some really nice positive feedback from some of our viewers. And just to give a quick recap, we've talked about the origins of America's interventionist policies, the turn toward empire and interventionism that took place in 1898 during the Spanish-American War, and then the move toward interventionism into World War I and the disastrous consequences of that war, which led the overwhelming majority of the American people to say, never again will we get involved in another European conflict. And then you had the growth of the progressive movement, the rise of the income tax, the Federal Reserve, federal spending, federal debt, leading on to the Great Depression. And you had Roosevelt's antics in terms of lying to the American people, telling them that he was a non-interventionist, that he was trying to keep America out of war, when in fact he was doing everything he could to get America into the war, to circumvent the majority will of the people, to circumvent the congressional requirement of a congressional declaration of war. He figured he just would maneuver the Japanese or the Germans into firing the first shot, in which case Congress would have no choice and America would have no choice but to go to war. And so rather than spend time dealing with the war itself and the battles and so forth, I think really what we ought to do is go right into the consequences of World War II. Because let's face it, Richard, it's sold as the good war. It's the one intervention that the interventionists really point to and say, yeah, look at how favorable World War II was. Okay, everything else is a disaster right now in the Middle East, Libya, Iraq, Syria, Afghanistan. But boy, they'll always point to World War II, what they called the good war, which, as you pointed out, killed some 60 million people. I mean, a phenomenal number of people. So let me start out by giving what I think is the most flagrant and the most negative perspective of the consequences in World War II, and that was with respect to the Soviet Union. I mean, here the United States had partnered with this brutal communist regime to win the war, and people say, oh, well, that's realpolitik, and that was all necessary. We had to partner with evil to destroy evil. And I never bought that. I mean, to me, you can fight a war without partnering with evil. There was never any real reason why we had to provide the Russians or the Soviets with armaments and weaponry and so forth. Let them fight their battle on their end, and we fight our battle at our end. Because at the end of the war, Richard, Britain and France had declared war on Germany originally because the Nazis had invaded Poland. And so the implicit idea of the guarantee that Britain had given was that we're going to free the Poles if they're subjected to this Nazi tyranny. Well, at the end of the war, that was a great success. I mean, there was no question that the Nazi regime had been defeated, that it was a horribly brutal, horrific, evil regime. And so ever since, the interventionists have said, see, we won, we won. And what's interesting, though, is their use of that pronoun we. Because by we, they're including the Soviet communist partners that had participated in the war right alongside with them as a partnership. Well, at the end of the war, the Poles are freed from Nazi tyranny only to be subjected to the tyranny of the Soviet Union, Soviet communists. And that's why I think when some American president went over there to celebrate some anniversary of World War II, I think it was George H.W. Bush, the Poles weren't celebrating at all. And because they never saw it as a victory. I mean, to suffer under communist tyranny for some 45 years or so instead of Nazi tyranny, I mean, some victory. Americans may consider that a victory, but certainly the people in Czechoslovakia and Poland and other parts of Eastern Europe certainly did not consider that a great victory. So here you had really sort of an ironic twist to it, that American soldiers had died to defeat Nazi Germany in order to free Poland from Nazi tyranny, only to have them fight and die so that the Eastern Europeans could live the rest of their lives, or at least the next 45 years or so, under communist tyranny. What do you think?
Well, I think that it was a strange policy position. The general premise is that the Nazi regime was so diabolically evil and was so much of the more eminent threat that partnering with the Soviet Union was the only way to assure its defeat. Right after Nazi Germany invaded the Soviet Union on June 22nd, 1941, Winston Churchill, for example, spoke in the British Parliament and said that if Hitler were to invade hell, he, Churchill, would have a nice word to say about the devil. So in other words, Hitler was worse than the devil. Because Churchill himself had been a very staunch and avowed anti-communist for virtually all of his political career. In the case of the United States, Roosevelt had a strange attitude. Roosevelt's attitude was that the Soviet Union represented a country that had right ideals or right-thinking goals, but that the way the government was run under the communist regime was just a bit brutal and rough around the edges. The capstone of this, sort of anticipating some things of what we'll discuss today, is that when Roosevelt returned from the famous Yalta Conference in February of 1945, where he and Winston Churchill and Stalin sat around a table for over a week deciding the fate of the world, if you will, he came back to Washington, D.C., and at a cabinet meeting in which he was reporting on how the conference had gone, he told his cabinet members, you know, every time I meet Uncle Joe, that's how he referred to Stalin, Uncle Joe, every time I meet Uncle Joe, I like him a bit more, possibly because there's something of the Christian gentleman in him. Now, that tells you about a mindset when Joseph Stalin, who literally either mass murdered tens of millions of people or sent them to slave labor in the Gulag in Siberia, this is the Christian gentleman. He also was reported to have been by one of his physicians, and this was after the Tehran Conference, which had occurred in 1943, in which he first met Stalin. Roosevelt said something to the effect that there's something in the Russians different than the Americans. The Russians want to do only for the good of their society, whereas Americans are selfish and profit-making. And he viewed that as an evil. And then he also told one of his inner circle that I like dealing with Stalin. You make a deal with him, and that's all there is. There's no one else who has to give their approval. So he doesn't have to deal with a Congress
or the courts.
Yes. So I mean, Roosevelt had this bizarre notion. Now, of course, the flip side of that is, well, how did Stalin view Churchill and FDR? I mean, it's interesting to understand their respective psychologies entering into negotiations with each other, right? That affects, the stances and the positions taken and the games played. Right after, actually, before the end of the Second World War, in April of 1945, a delegation of Yugoslavian communists were on a mission to Moscow to meet with Stalin to discuss post-war, policies in Eastern Europe. And Milovan Dijlas, who was a close confidant of communist Yugoslav leader Tito for many years before he became a dissident and was imprisoned, he wrote a little book about this called Conversations with Stalin. And he related two things that perhaps are of note. He said, and this was after having met at the Yalta Conference with Roosevelt and Churchill, Stalin said, that Churchill, he would put his hand in your pocket to steal a kopeck. That's like the Russian version of a penny, to steal a kopeck. Roosevelt, he dips in for bigger coins. Okay, so in Stalin's mind, everything that Roosevelt or Churchill tried to compromise about, be sort of open, to make deals, this is all part of the bourgeois capitalist conspiracy. They're working on us to deceive us so they can sort of like put their hand and pick out the big coins, the big coins.
Which is really what socialism is all about.
And the other element is that again, before we sort of get into some of the conferences and their consequences, how did Stalin view the outcomes of these wartime conferences that were meant to set the stage for a post-war peace, a United Nations in which the U.S. and the Soviet Union and Britain was conceived also, would sort of be like policemen of the world to assure that a world war never happened again. What was Stalin's attitude about this? He told also this delegation of Yugoslavian communists, again, this is April 1945, he says, well, as far as your army goes, that's where you impose your ideological system. So in Stalin's mind, it was all a matter of grabbing as much of Eastern Europe as possible and imposing communist regimes. And then he added, well, we'll recover from the destruction of the war and we'll pick up our pants and in 20 years we'll be at it again. In other words, for him, this was like a prelude or an interlude, but before another war finally to destroy the capitalist West. So Churchill perhaps less, but Roosevelt is in this la-la land. Oh, those communists, they're a little rough around the edges, but if we just sort of deal with them, or as he told one of his confidants again, before he went off to the conference in Yalta, I think that if I give Stalin everything he wants, and I ask nothing in return, noblesse l'oblige, that Stalin will work with me for a post-war world of peace and prosperity for all. This is how Roosevelt approached these conferences. Let me sort of give a little summary, however briefly, of both Roosevelt's positions and Stalin's attitudes, because this sets the stage of everything that happened in the post-war period. First, at the Tehran conference.
Okay, wait a minute. Before you get into the conferences, let's put things in perspective. Comparing Hitler with Stalin, though,
Right.
that it's difficult to compare evil, of course, but isn't it true that Stalin killed a lot more people than Hitler did?
It is true that if you do a body count, the mass murderer of the century is probably Chairman Mao. Chairman Mao in communist China, from the time the communists gained control of the Chinese mainland in 1949 until Mao's death in 1976, it is estimated that in building socialism, wiping out elements of what he viewed as pre-communist bourgeois society, hunting out enemies of the people, going after what he viewed as his enemies within the party itself. Even with the archives closed, Chinese and Western historians and experts on China estimate that under Chairman Mao, somewhere in the name of 80 million, that's 80 million people were killed in the name of building socialism and doing away with the enemies of the people in the revolution. Now, if you compare Stalin and Hitler, really the Nazi regime and the Soviet regime, it has been estimated that in terms of unarmed civilians, the Nazis killed probably in the neighborhood of about 25 million people. That's 6 million Jews, 3 million Poles, 500,000 Gypsies, 250,000 of good Aryan Germans, but who were enemies of the National Socialist state, or people who were defined as genetic inferiors, right? People with mental illnesses. They took out euthanasia plans on those who had mental or physical defects, disgusting procedures. And then they invaded Poland and the Soviet Union. And it is estimated that somewhere in the neighborhood of 10 million Russians and Belarusians and Ukrainians, unarmed civilians again, were killed during the Nazi occupation of those parts of the Soviet Union. And then you have to add in how many French were killed, or Danes, or Dutch, or Norwegians, and so on. But some historians estimated that the Nazis killed up in unarmed civilians, not war-related deaths, in the neighborhood possibly of 25 million. Now, how do you compare that to the Soviet Union? Now, they came to power in 1917. There was a 3-year civil war between 1918 to 1921, at which point Lenin triumphed in setting up the Soviet Union. Stalin ruled from around the time of Lenin's death in 1924 until his own dying of a cerebral hemorrhage in March of 1953, about a quarter of a century. And then you had basically Khrushchev and the others that led up to the last one, Gorbachev. And the Soviet Union ended in 1991, 25 years ago this year. But it's estimated, again, by historians, and this with access, at least partially in the 1990s after the fall of the Soviet Union, to KGB and Communist Party archives, that under the communist regime, somewhere in the neighborhood of 64 to 68 million people were killed. Again, unarmed civilians in the name of building socialism. That would have included, it's estimated, somewhere in the neighborhood of 9 million Russians and Ukrainian peasants during the forced collectivization of the land in the early 1930s. And then millions who were sent to the Gulag and worked to death as slaves, building railways to nowhere, digging out gold and uranium in the far reaches of the Siberian North, and so on. So 64 to 68 million. So, and out of that 64 and 68 million, it's probably not unfair to say that at least half, if not more, certainly more, died during the Stalinist periods from the late 1920s until his own death in 1953. So in terms, if you're just doing a raw body count, more people were killed by the communists in the Soviet Union and just under Stalin himself than the Nazis killed under Hitler during their reign of terror in Germany and then through the rest of occupied Europe. So Stalin certainly was the greater mass murderer. What you can say, and I say this somewhat sarcastically but true, and that is, who is the biggest mass murderer of communists in the 20th century? Joseph Stalin, because he kept seeing traitors and intriguers the purges, right? These purges that he carried out in the 1930s. So probably Stalin was the biggest mass murderer of communists in the 20th century. It's just that they were the disloyal, treacherous communists who he couldn't trust. So yes, in terms of a body count, certainly Stalin was the, other than Mao, as I said, was a monumental mass murderer, of which then Hitler comes in number 3.
All right, so here we have a war that's designed to free the Poles and implicitly Eastern Europe from the second place mass murderer, in order to, and then the consequence of the war at the end is that now these people are going to suffer for the next 45 years under the guy who has first place in the mass murders. Right. And that is a direct consequence of these conferences, Yalta and Tehran, that you're talking about. So why don't you go into those then?
Okay, Roosevelt believed in personal diplomacy. He believed that he had a persona, a talent for working with people. If you want to put a people person, if he could get to know a person and have that personal touch and rapport, deals could be cut. And in fact, he was a master of that in domestic politics. He did get elected 4 times, the unprecedented 4 times, 1932, 1936, 1940, and then 1944 during the war. He could play factions within the Democratic Party and members of Congress off each other. As he referred to himself as the juggler, in fact, in which the left hand was never always aware of what the right hand was doing, but that was good to keep everyone else off balance. But through his personal touch, to make everyone feel at home, drawn in. But he was a very manipulative individual. But he believed that what was true in domestic politics could play the same way in foreign affairs. That's why he valued Churchill's first approaches for a personal diplomacy between the two of them before America's entry into the Second World War in December of 1941. His long secret correspondence with Churchill, establishing these personal relationships, making the deals about how America would help Britain win the war. And then, of course, the famous Atlantic Conference off Newfoundland before America's entry into the war, which was meant to sort of tie this together. And he came to view the same thing with Stalin. If he could meet Stalin face to face, they would be able to cut a deal to assure a post-war world. And the first meeting was in Tehran in 1943, November 1943. And the reason they met in Tehran is because Stalin refused to travel anywhere outside of either the Soviet Union or Soviet-controlled territory. And Tehran, the capital of Iran, had basically been divided into occupation zones. The Soviet army had occupied northern Iran, and the British were in the south near the Persian Gulf as part of this wartime need to assure a flow of supplies and oil and so on. So Stalin was willing to travel to Iran, but only because it was under Soviet military occupation of that part of it. And so they met there, and Roosevelt took an attitude, again, as I said, if he could give Stalin everything he wanted and ask little in return, Stalin would work for him. And one of these things is that Stalin was adamant that even though, as part of his secret protocol in the non-aggression pact with Hitler, not just did they divide up Poland, but Stalin had the go-ahead to invade and annex the Baltic republics, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania. And Stalin was adamant about that. And Roosevelt tried to say, well, shouldn't there be like an election or something? And Stalin stood firm. And when he came back and he was challenged about this, Roosevelt said, well, I had to agree with it. And besides, we know that if there was an election, they'd want to be part of the Soviet Union anyway. Well, Roosevelt, not only the juggler, the mind reader for several million people, but the real main event between them was at that Yalta Conference in February of 1945, because this determined really the fate of the post-World War. It had several components to it. There were three. One, the fate of Germany, a post-war Europe in general, the war in the Far East, and then finally a fourth one, the United Nations. And everything that Roosevelt did, his concessions, his compromises, his willing to just let Stalin do what he wanted in many areas, it's clear that for his mind, these were all necessary compromises and concessions for one goal, that Stalin would participate in a new and better League of Nations, the United Nations, for world peace. Now, in the case of Germany, the proposal had been for the dismemberment of Germany. In fact, the most radical one had been designed by Hans Morgenthau, who had been Secretary of the Treasury in a Roosevelt administration, in which he proposed that not only Germany be divided up into little principalities like before German unification in the 1870s, but that they be deindustrialized, and Germans would only be allowed to be farmers and light craftsmen. Well, how do you support a population of the 20th century, even minus the war deaths, if you're like a pastoral country of primitive agriculture? But that was one of the proposals meant. But the upshot is that was not the policy taken, but Germany was to be divided into occupation zones: British, French, American, and Soviet. And the Soviets got what in terms of pre-World War II German territory, that is Germany on a map before 1939, the Soviets basically occupied about half of Germany. And then Stalin had such contempt for the French that he said, well, if you want the French to have an occupation zones, you can carve it out of the British and the American zones. They ain't getting none of the Soviet zone. So Germany's fate was divided between them. And they supposedly would associate, but it was expected that the Stalin would just have his way with his part of Germany. Then the other aspect of it was that Berlin would be a multi-occupied city. And as the agreements were, there would be East Germany, East Berlin, which would be the Soviet zone, and then West Berlin would be divided into British, American, and French zones, but separated by over 100 miles from the zones of the British and the Americans, and therefore depended upon the Soviets for air, road, and rail transport. The next aspect of this was what was going to happen with Eastern European countries: Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Romania, Bulgaria, Yugoslavia, Albania. In 1944, the British had landed in Greece and had set up a government there that clearly was going to be anti-communist. So Greece was not in that because Churchill was grabbing that for himself as a sort of a British protected regime in the Eastern Mediterranean. But what would happen to these other countries? Now, in the Yalta Agreement, all talk was about fair and unrestricted elections. But as one member of Roosevelt's delegation at Yalta said, the agreement was phrased in such a broad and unspecific way that it could be stretched from Yalta to Washington, and you still wouldn't know what was actually promised. And so what basically happened, and was happening even as the Yalta Conference itself was in progress, because by that time, virtually all of these Eastern European countries had been, quote, liberated by the Soviet army, except for Yugoslavia. Yugoslavia basically was liberated by indigenous communist resistance forces led by Tito. The Soviets, in short order, began eliminating all opposition. They did away with anti-communist or pre-war parties. They in sort of make-believe coalition governments manipulated it that communists were in the central ministries like security or education or foreign affairs. The upshot of it is that between 1945 and 1948, every one of these countries in Eastern Europe was transformed into a carbon copy of Stalin's type of totalitarian dictatorship. The final one happening in 1948, when finally the shell of a democratic government in Yugoslavia was overthrown and a full communist government put in place. The coup de grace of that is that I believe it was the prime minister of Yugoslavia mysteriously, for some unknown reason, flew out of the window of a multi-story building and seemingly on his own died when he hit the pavement. That's so from Stalin's point of view, as I said, his attitude was that where your army stops, that's where your ideological banner is planted. As far as the Far East was concerned, Stalin had entered into a non-aggression pact with the Japanese in the spring of 1941. And he abided by that non-aggression pact, so much so that when General Doolittle undertook the famous raid on Tokyo in 1942, meant to be our revenge raid for Pearl Harbor, Roosevelt's administration had approached the Soviet government and requested that could the planes land in Siberia, because they didn't have enough fuel to get from the aircraft carriers halfway across the Pacific, bomb Tokyo, and then get back to the aircraft carriers. Stalin said no. So the planes either crashed into the East China Sea, that is between Japan and China, or had been shot down during their bomb run, or they landed and crashed in China itself, basically in Japanese-occupied parts of China. And a few of the crews were saved, but basically because of anti-Japanese guerrillas behind Japanese lines. So Stalin abided by this. So the idea was that if Japan was to be defeated, you needed the Soviet entry into the war. And the deal there was that Stalin said that he would enter the war within 3 months after the war in Europe ended, but at a price. Part of Japan's territory. The southern half of Sakhalin Island, it had been divided between the Soviets and Japan. The Kuril Islands, which are north of Hokkaido, the northern island of Japan. And that he would have a free hand in Manchuria. Railways running through Manchuria would be set up as, quote, joint Soviet-Chinese railway companies. And the Japanese naval base at the southern tip of Manchuria, which had been a Imperial Russian base before the Russo-Japanese War of 1905 that the Russians lost, that be returned as a Soviet naval base. So now Stalin is acting as an old-fashioned imperialist. He wants a naval base in another country's territory. It's just he's going to take it from the Japanese. And the other agreement is that Korea would be divided into U.S. and Soviet zones. So that was Stalin's price for entering the war against Japan. But on the understanding that the Chinese government would not be told about any of these provisos in the unpublished parts of the Yalta Agreement in February 1945. So basically, Roosevelt, with sort of just accepting Churchill, make a deal with Stalin to transfer Japanese territory, hand over Manchuria to the Soviets, without even informing the Chinese government, which is our ally in the war under Chiang Kai-shek, that the entire northeast of their country is being handed over to the tender care of Comrade Stalin. And so these are the elements: the division of Germany, the handing over Eastern Europe to Stalin, where Stalin basically have a free hand to do what they want, and giving Stalin a free hand in a huge part of northeastern Asia as a price to enter the war, all for Stalin to accept participation in the United Nations. And he even had prices for that. Well, it was presumed that each member of the Soviet Union would have one vote in the General Assembly, right? The general members. No, there's not enough socialist countries. So I want my vote, that is the Soviet Union, plus votes for Soviet Ukraine and Soviet Belarusia. So Stalin gets 3 votes, where everyone else gets 1. Now, I want to add a side thing about, if I can, about FDR's deviousness and manipulative cruelty. China had been fighting the Japanese from 1937. The Japanese had occupied practically a third of mainland China. The U.S. had, after our entry into the war, had obviously was sending war material officially with congressional approval to the Chinese government. Roosevelt sent a U.S. general, Stilwell, to sort of be Chiang Kai-shek's aide, confidant, military advisor, how to resist and maybe push back the Japanese as part of the joint war effort. Well, Stilwell came to hate Chiang Kai-shek, just thought him as a pipsqueak dictator, corrupt, always demanding things that were over the moon. He couldn't stand him. So Roosevelt finally told Stilwell, well, if you can't deal with him, get rid of him. You know what I mean. So Stilwell then has members of his staff set up an assassination plot. Chiang Kai-shek and his wife, Madam Chiang, were going to go on a state visit to British India, right across the Himalayas from China. Now, on the way back, after the state visit, the plan was that there would be engine problems, and that Chiang Kai-shek and Madam Chiang would be given parachutes that would have been tampered with so that they jump out and they die. And this plan was now put in motion. But then Stilwell asked Roosevelt for a final approval to go through with it. And FDR said, okay, don't do it. But it was only FDR's decision at the last minute that prevented the U.S. from assassinating through faulty parachutes the head of the nationalist Chinese government, who is our ally fighting the Japanese. So this is Roosevelt. Okay, this is Roosevelt. And this what was the result of this? The fact is that half of Europe remained under the boot of Soviet communism and Soviet military occupation from 1945 until the 1989, 1990, when finally, under Gorbachev, Soviet forces start withdrawing from Eastern Europe. And then in November 1989, the Berlin Wall falls. And then finally, in December of 1991, the Soviet Union itself implodes. But for half a century, after the defeat of the tyranny of Hitler and the Nazis, only then, after another half century, were the people of Eastern Europe given a chance to both have personal freedoms as well as democratic governments. In the Far East, the fact that Roosevelt had acquiesced in handing over all of Manchuria to the Soviets, and by the way, the Soviets only entered the war around the same time as we were dropping the nuclear bombs. So, in fact, given that we dropped the nuclear bombs and they sort of instigated the Japanese agreeing to the surrender terms, this was a price that the U.S. paid that wouldn't have even had to be paid in terms of a Japanese defeat. But the result of this is the Soviet army swarmed into Manchuria. They disarmed the Kwangdong Japanese army that occupied Manchuria. And then they allowed Mao Zedong's guerrilla forces that were headquartered mostly in the northern part of China proper to go into Manchuria and occupy most of Manchuria. And they armed Mao's military forces with all the captured Japanese weaponry. And at the same time, they strip all the factories in the industrial centers of Manchuria and ship those factories back to the Soviet Union. So they basically plunder the industry in that part of China and arm the communists. And that sets the stage, basically, for what, between 1946 and 1949, becomes the Chinese Civil War, out of which Mao is triumphant. And again, because of American policy. The U.S. under Truman, with General Marshall as his representative, trying to negotiate between Mao and Chiang Kai-shek, decides that Chiang and his nationalist government are negotiating in bad faith. So the U.S. government imposes an arms embargo on China. This means that not only is the U.S. government not selling or giving arms to Chiang's anti-communist armies, they're prohibited from just privately buying arms, right, with their own money from American arms makers. While Mao has all of these armaments gotten from the Japanese and then from the Russians. So as a consequence, these policies all help set the stage for what was not only the communist enslavement of Eastern Europe, but the communist conquest of China itself. And there is still a communist regime that still does bad things in the mainland of China today.
Yeah, I mean, that's the real irony of this thing, is that they go in there supposedly to free the Poles and Eastern Europe from tyranny, and at the end of the war, they deliver them as a result of a conscious decision at these conferences. They deliver them into the clutches of Soviet communism. China, who Roosevelt had said we need to keep safe from Japanese tyranny, ends up under Chinese communist rule,
Right.
and it still is. And then, Richard, there was a huge transformation of American life as a result of all this. Because not only do you get the Korean War, not only do you get the Vietnam War, and the anti-communist crusade, you get a transformation of the federal government itself, a major
Yes.
revolutionary transformation called the national security state, which is the same type of totalitarian structure that was existing in communist China and still exists in the Soviet Union. The idea was we have to be like the communists to fight the new official enemy. And who was the
Right.
new official enemy? It was the Soviet Union, to whom they had delivered Eastern Europe into its clutches. And they said, well, now they're essentially stepping into Hitler's shoes to oppose the Soviet Union.
Right.
And part of their excuse was, well, look at this aggression that he's maintaining a continued occupation in Eastern Europe when they had acceded to that.
Right.
And so now you have this major transformation in American life, America's governmental structure, with this totalitarian-like structure, the Pentagon, a huge standing military establishment, the CIA, later the NSA, where you've got this huge anti-communist crusade. They're doing all these things like assassinations, regime change operations. I mean, they totally transformed American life, keeping files on Americans, trying to destroy organizations that were like sympathetic to what was going on in Cuba, a country that really never attacked the United States at all. It was always the other way around. It was a national security state that was trying to assassinate Castro, invade Cuba. I mean, that the whole predominant mindset was transformed in America really into an anti-freedom direction, both externally as well as inside the United States. And this is what they call victory, the interventionists. This is what they call a great triumph. I mean, with victories like that, Richard, who needs defeats?
Yes, the legacy of the wartime conferences, particularly the Yalta Conference, set the stage for everything that happened in the post-war period. Even if we had not agreed to these things that Roosevelt agreed to, would the Soviets have ending up occupying Eastern Europe? No doubt. Was it even possible that China might have gone communist in the post-war period? Yes. Chiang Kai-shek's nationalist government was not the epitome of an individualist limited government regime, quite the contrary. But the fact is that the Yalta Conference did something that was extremely important for Soviet propaganda. It legitimized the division of Europe. It legitimized the presence of Soviet tyranny on those countries. Well, the U.S. agreed to it. These were the terms. We held our phony baloney elections in 1946 and 47. The outcome is that these regimes ended up being friends of the Soviet Union. And America is a bourgeois threat. Of course, we had to help our fraternal neighbors in Eastern Europe with Soviet military presence to guard them against American aggression, because clearly the capitalist countries are planning the invasion of the socialist world. So all of these things set the stage for it. And I would just mention, Jacob, since obviously the modest, unassertive wallflower that you always are, you have not mentioned that we have a book.
Oh,
and
yes.
This book is called The Failure of America's Foreign Wars. Jacob and I edited this book. This has essays by both of us, plus others who have been major loyal contributors to the Future Freedom Foundation for a long time. It came out in 1995. It's an oldie, but still a goodie. And this emphasizes the policies leading to and the consequences from the First World War, the Second World War, and then these post-World War II wars and Cold War strategies that Jacob was just referring to. And I highly recommend that anyone who's been interested in the type of things we're talking about, here are the more detailed and specific historical facts and references that bolster the type of interpretive arguments that Jacob and I have been giving over the last several segments of this series.
Yeah, no, great point. And let's face it, we're still living with the legacy of World War II. We still have the national security estate, which should have gone out of existence at the very least when the Cold War ended. We still have NATO provoking crises, absorbing all the former Warsaw Pact countries, despite having promised that NATO would go out of business when the Warsaw Pact went out of business, and provoking the crisis in Ukraine. We still have the enormous worldwide empire of military bases, foreign interventionism, the war on terrorism. I mean, it's really an evolutionary outgrowth of what begins in 1898, moves through World War I, magnifies in World War II, and then just blows up after the end of World War II into this enormous big government warfare state that we have today. Well, we're way past time, Richard. Let me take this opportunity while we're on the subject of books that we've got a fantastic series that we're getting ready to launch in the next month or so by Richard Ebeling. It's a video series on an introduction to Austrian economics. It's fantastic. I mean, you couldn't find a better series. It consists of 9 lectures of about 20 to 25 minutes each, where Richard discusses various aspects of Austrian economics. It's great for the beginner. It's great for the person that already is well versed in Austrian economics. It's a great way to get your friends involved in Austrian economics and libertarianism. In conjunction with that, we're also launching a fantastic ebook by Richard that provides an introduction to Austrian economics, consisting of about 40 chapters. You couldn't find a better book that introduces people to the principles involved with this area of economic thought. So we're pretty excited about that coming out, Richard.
Thank you. And for the viewers and listeners, every time he says nice things like that, I owe him $5. But I still appreciate that he said it.
All right. Well, this wraps up our series on World War II, our 5-part series. I hope you guys enjoyed it. And Richard, I look forward to seeing you next week, and I look forward to seeing our viewers next week.
Absolutely.